Okay, hello everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the 2025 Access, Innovation, and Disability Symposium. We are so excited to have you all here. Funding for this symposium was made possible through CU Boulder's Impact Grant, the Office for Access and Community Engagement in the College of Arts and Sciences, CU Libraries, and Be Well. My name is Marysia. I use she, her pronouns, and I have had the pleasure of serving as co-chair of the symposium's planning committee this year. I am also the program manager for access and community engagement in the College of Arts and Sciences. And for those that require a physical description, I have light brown skin, long black hair that is down, brown eyes, and I'm wearing round eyeglasses and a green sweatshirt. Before we introduce today's keynote speaker, I would like to remind everyone to please mute themselves during the presentation and that closed captioning is available by clicking the CC button. Please do feel free to use the chat during the presentation to interact with one another or with our speaker. We'll be using the last 10 to 15 minutes of this hour together for questions, during which time you're free to raise your hand or use the chat. As a reminder, this session is being recorded, but I will stop the recording during the final Q&A portion. This symposium was first started in 2022 when David Raz, currently the Director of Faculty Affairs in the College of Arts and Sciences, identified a need for CU Boulder to create a space not only for research and education on disability studies to be shared, but also for those with disabilities, especially students, to feel supported and seen. With the Access, Innovation, and Disability Symposium, we aspire for CU to be a place where disability justice, the full inclusion of people with disabilities, is realized. However, we recognize that we are not there yet and that we have a long way to go. And this is just one step in a series of steps. And on that note, this step would not have been possible without the help of our planning committee. These committee members have put so much time and effort into planning this year's symposium, in addition to their full-time jobs with the university. So I'd like to take a moment to shout out each one of them: Denise Adelson, Sonja Benton, Casey Boyd, David Braz, Maria Janelle Holmes, Patricia Gonzalez, Gavin Lang, DJ McCree, my co-chair Elizabeth Novosel, Adele Ronan, Seth Taylor, Costa Tofstiari, and Casey Woodcock. And now I will pass it over to Sonja to introduce today's keynote speaker.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sonja. I use they and EU pronouns. And for those of you that need it, my physical description is that I have long brown curly hair, a kind of thick metallic necklace and black shirt, as well as glasses and pale skin. You will occasionally see my dark desk chair pop up behind me, and then my background has the disability flag transposed over some mountains with a lovely QR code leading to the symposium website. Thank you so much for joining us for our keynote. I am so excited to introduce our speaker, Hayden Kristal, who uses they, them pronouns, is a Colorado-based deaf queer activist and a stand-up comedian. Life at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities has led Hayden to a career as a professional speaker, exploring the intersections of ability, gender, sexuality, and access, particularly within the spheres of activism and social justice. They have brought their funny, engaging, and interactive workshops and speeches to dozens of conferences, businesses, and schools all across the continent. Hayden's quick wit and cheerful self-deprecation has earned them plenty of comedic accolades as well, including a good number of followers on TikTok, a semi-finalist spot on America's Got Talent, a guest role on Netflix and Adult Swim's Tuca and Birdie, and much, much more, including being a semi-finalist for Stand Up NBC and a finalist for Full Frontal with Samantha Bee's comedy writing mentorship, and so much more. With that, I am excited to introduce Hayden.
Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. Sonja, thank you so much for that amazing intro. I'm really excited to be here. I hope that y'all are excited to be here. Today we're going to be talking about the importance of intersectional accessibility, which is kind of a buzzword soup that we will be breaking down together. But before we jump into stuff, I want to go over some ground rules for this event, for this space, for the duration of today. But first I'll give a visual description. I have lighter skin, I have brown hair in a ponytail off to the side, and I look pretty dehydrated because I have been living off of Diet Coke for the past 30 years. We're going to go over some ground rules. The first one, that is the most important to me, is that we are going to treat this like a Twitch stream. So this is y'all's symposium. This is by and for your community. So I want to make sure that you get the most out of this. Also, I am like Tinkerbell in that if I do not receive enough attention, I will die. So because I'm just saying this into the void of blank space, please feel free to use the chat function. And like a Twitch or YouTube streamer, I will read along and answer your questions, your comments. The second that you have a question or comment or anything, please go ahead and put it in the chat. We don't have to wait until the end. There's no like designated Q&A time. I have ADHD, heavily medicated, doesn't really put a dent in it. So the moment the impulse strikes you, put it in that chat. I may tell you to hold on for a second, but I promise we'll get back to it. The second ground rule is that I assume if you're here in this space today, it's because you want to learn. It's because you want to hear a perspective that's different than yours because you're here to grow. And so we're going to all support each other in that journey. Today, there are no stupid questions. So if somebody asks something that maybe seems obvious to you or seems maybe I love the Tinkerbell that just came up in the chat. But if somebody asks something that maybe seems obvious to you or is maybe phrased in a way that you would not choose to phrase something, we're going to assume that everybody who's here is asking from a place of good intent. So we are not going to make fun of anybody until they are well out of earshot or chat range. Sound good? I don't really care. This is a dictatorship. But I think there was one more ground rule, but I can't hold you to. In the spirit of learning, if somebody needs a definition, or if I am talking too quickly, or if I use a word or a phrase in a way that makes it seem like everybody just knows what that means and you should know what it means and you don't, please stop me. Because I promise you that you are not the only person that has a question. And if I am saying something or communicating something in a way that doesn't make sense to you, you are not stupid. It is not a failure on your part as somebody who's here to learn. It's a failure on my part as an educator. And if I can take a chance to rectify that. Sorry, my dog just headbutted the baby gate until it fell over. I don't know if you could hear that. So she could go upstairs and try to eat the dog food she's not supposed to have. Anyways, you may also see a little dog darting in and out of frame. They're here to help. But so that being said, if I say something too quickly or you don't understand, please stop me. Happy to answer any question that you might have. Hunter says, I'm very excited for the intersection of education and comedy. Good, because I do think that there's a big intersection there, and we're going to talk about that today. So the name of this workshop is The Importance of Intersectional Accessibility, which, as I said, is kind of buzzwordy. So I think a good place to start is by breaking that down. Casey says, I hope the dog makes an appearance. If you guys are good, if this goes well, I will grab a dog at the end. I can do that. That's a bribe I'm willing to entertain. So when we're talking about intersectional accessibility, I think that there's a lot of kind of confusion and some opacity, just those words are kind of nebulous. So we're going to start by breaking it down. We're going to start with accessibility. And I think the place we start breaking down the word accessibility is starting with disability. So does anybody have a definition of disability that they would like to share in the chat? I'll give you a second. What I really need is like a little button I can hit that has the Jeopardy music on it to play during these. But if not, that's fine. You can keep typing them if you're typing them. So there's a couple different ways to define disability. So I think the main way when I say define disability, what most people think of is what's called the medical model of disability. So the idea that there is something about an individual that does not come up to this mainstream standard that we've set, and that individual needs individual accommodations to function to kind of bring them up to that level of norm. So for example, I am deaf or hard of hearing. I use either word depending on the context, which I'm also happy to explain if anybody has any questions about that. This is your time. But so the medical model of disability would look at that and say, I do not hear as well as the average person. And so I need things like hearing aids or interpreters or closed captioning or whatever to kind of be able to bring me up to that baseline level of functioning. So the medical model of disability is kind of that idea is that there is a baseline norm and that disability is what happens when somebody falls short of it. And when we look at accessibility from that perspective, that's kind of, we're talking about bringing people up to that norm. So I think that would be a more mainstream perspective. Is that people heard that? Or people familiar with that? I'll also take, I think you can send emojis and stuff. Maybe I'm wrong on this one, but
Well, there's no reactions, unfortunately, but they can put emojis in the chat.
okay, great. Melinda said beautiful explanation. Thank you, Melinda. And I like how you spell your name. Good. Well, as long as Melinda is good with it, then we'll move on to the other way to look at disability, which is something called the social model of disability. So the medical model looks at the individual and the ways they don't meet up to that standard. The social model of disability says that, in a nutshell, I do not have a disability. I am disabled by things in my environment that are not accessible to me. So whereas the medical model would say, I do not hear as well as the average person, so I need help to bring me up to that norm. The social model of disability says that society is not accessible to people who don't hear that level, don't hear to that baseline level, and that's something that can be fixed communally, right? Like that's a societal barrier and not an individual level barrier. So, which again gets a little complicated. It's a little more sociology, a little bit of theory. But the example I like to use is a place called Gallaudet University, which is in Washington, D.C. It's the only all deaf liberal arts college. So everything there is set up for deaf and hard of hearing people. So like all of the hallways are extra wide so that you can walk down them side by side, face each other and sign. All of the alarms and everything have lights that flash instead of just sounds. All of the classes there are taught in ASL. All of the even things like going to, if you want to buy food on campus, everybody there is fluent in sign language. Everything there is set up for deaf and hard of hearing people. I will say that use American Sign Language. And so when I was at Gallaudet, I wasn't experiencing disability, right? I think baseline we can call disability as anything in the social model is anything that impedes access, any barrier to access, right? And in Gallaudet, in that situation, I didn't inherently, quote, have a disability, right? No part of my functioning was not, at the baseline. There was no part of that society that I was unable to access because of my inability to hear, right? But I would say in that situation that if we picked you guys up and we airdropped you in, for those of y'all that don't know sign language, you might experience pretty significant barriers to access. If your whole classes were taught in a language that you didn't understand, if there was no way to, communicate, if you weren't given access to an interpreter, somebody who was willing to write things out, if people weren't willing to work with you to tear down the barriers that were coming up for you in that situation, right? You may experience a disability. So the social model kind of takes the idea that these barriers to access crop up as a point of individual failing and reframes it as what barriers is society creating, which I happen to ascribe to and I love. Sorry, got a little distracted as part of the I'm trying to make sure that there's no more dog nonsense happening. But so those are the two main ways to look at disability. And so we can look at accessibility kind of from those two main perspectives too, right? When we're talking about accessibility versus and accommodations. So you can look at accessibility from the medical model as, again, those things that individuals do. So for me, like a hearing aid or a cochlear implant. For somebody with a limb difference, maybe it's a prosthetic. For people with like ADHD, it's taking medication. It's the things that we can do to augment that individual's body to bring them up to the standard so that we don't have to change these societal barriers. Whereas the social model of disability looks at accessibility in terms of what we can do socially, how society is built, the structures that we accept, and the systems that we accept as being the norm, and whether or not those are conducive to people's full participation. So when we look at something like Gallaudet, their accessibility isn't about having hearing aids, it's about using a language that's accessible to everybody there. When we're talking about, alarms and something, it's not giving someone a surgery so that they're able to hear the alarm, it's changing it to a light, it's meeting the individual where they're at. And I really like that perspective because the example I love to use is when we talk about accessibility and disability is the idea of what's that baseline is when in the medical model is so arbitrary. And the way I explain that is like we think about sharks, and sharks have this, they have that like ability to sense electrical impulses in the water, and we don't. So, or I don't. I'll speak for myself. I don't. And so I think the majority of people don't. So we didn't build a society where that's necessary, right? We didn't build a society where you have to be able to sense those impulses. Otherwise, you are not going to be able to meet up to the standard. But if sharks had designed our society, they probably would, right? If that's something that they assume that most of their community is able to do. So it's the idea that these barriers that we've put up, these things that we've decided are kind of arbitrary, I guess, to repeat myself. So, any questions? Are we good there? Celine said, powerful comparison between disability and language barrier. Celine, and thank you. And I think that is a great way to slide into the next part of what we're going to be talking about. We've talked about accessibility and disability. And so now we're going to talk a little bit about intersectionality, which I think particularly over the past couple of years has become really, really buzzwordy. And with that has become less and less clear about what intersectionality is and what it means. So intersectionality was a phrase that was originally coined by Black feminists, that was used and was kind of brought into mainstream academic consciousness by a scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw. And it was coined to talk about the intersection of being both Black and a woman, and how that differed from the experience of Black men and white women. So it was coined to talk about how the experience of those two marginalized identities combined differed from the experience of identity A, marginalized identity A, and marginalized identity B on their own. And the different needs and the different experiences and barriers that those women would face at that intersection, as opposed to A or B in isolation, which again can be kind of confusing. So the example I like to use is, imagine for a second, I am both a deaf or hard of hearing person and an LGBTQ person. And I want to go talk to a therapist about my gender identity, right? So ignoring everything else, like I have the time to do it, I have the money to do it, there's someone in my area that does that, ignoring everything else, like I set up the appointment, I bring an interpreter because that's what I need to be able to function effectively and communicate effectively in that space. And the interpreter is either explicitly homophobic or even just like uncomfortable or unfamiliar with LGBTQ culture and identities, right? So all of the communication in that room is going to be passing through that interpreter. Do you think that's going to impact the care that I receive in that space? And while I'm waiting for you to respond, I'm not gaslighting you. If you've noticed me switching out between a coffee and a Diet Coke, I just need to be caffeinated. I'm going back and forth. Hunter and Celine were correct. And they said, for sure, undoubtedly, Casey said, absolutely, yeah, 100%. That is going to impact the care that I receive. And that particular situation is not coming about because I'm just an LGBTQ person, right? Because if I was a hearing LGBTQ person going to this appointment, I wouldn't be dependent on the interpreter, right, to have those access needs met. I wouldn't have that go between. I wouldn't have that point of vulnerability. And if I was a straight deaf or hard of hearing person, I wouldn't have to care what the interpreter thought about LGBTQ people. I would hope that I would, but I wouldn't have to as a matter of getting access to the care that I need. So intersectionality was coined to talk about this intersection of these two marginalized identities, how those identities overlap and knit together, and the unique vulnerabilities and experiences that are created at that intersection that aren't necessarily experienced by people who are a member of Group A or Group B on its own. And that is something that is really important to me and something that I started thinking about a lot, particularly when I was in college, because I am a deaf or hard of hearing person and I'm a member of the LGBTQ community. And I was really involved in LGBTQ activism and events and activities and creating spaces in college. And the number one, I would say this remains true, the number one place that I struggle, or the number one sphere I struggle in getting accessibility for my disability tends to be in these social justice oriented spaces. So things like I would go to a pride event that would have no interpreters, or I would go to one of my favorite examples is my friend who is a wheelchair user and I were asked to speak on a panel for LGBTQ people with disabilities, and there was no interpreter, and the room was not wheelchair accessible. So when I was in college and I noticed this, like there being a distinct lack of accessibility in these social justice spaces, I really started reading about the theory of intersectionality and the theories of accessibility and what these two things meant and how they played together. Because it was very confusing to me right off of that I found these social justice oriented spaces to be so inaccessible. It seems really counterintuitive, right? You would think a place that prides itself on inclusion would be super accessible, right? And when we talk about accessibility, I think there's tends to be a focus of on these kind of like again that more medicalized model, right? So these things that we do to like make our spaces more accessible for people with physical disabilities. And when I would go to request those, like the problem with those things is that they often cost money, right? So particularly when I was a student, there was a focus on like making sure we're using inclusive language, making sure we're doing, we're acknowledging different groups and making sure that the language that we're using is welcoming and we're mentioning every different identity. And those are things that are good and important to do and also free to do. And the accessibility for things for physical disabilities was something that was a little more out of reach financially. It costs money to hire an interpreter. And I feel like, and this continues to be true for me in social justice spaces, when I called a space out for being inaccessible, instead of having the like frank discussions about like, this is not something we can afford to do right now, or we chose to go ahead with this event knowing that it's inaccessible or not knowing it's inaccessible, but we're choosing to go ahead with it because we don't have the resources to be able to make it accessible. I feel like the gut reaction to a lot of that tended to be like, well, no, it's not. Like it tended to be a lot of denial, I guess, which is frustrating, but it makes sense because like this is my job, right? So I am passionate about this. I teach workshops about intersectional accessibility. And so it's something that I care, like justice is something that I care deeply about. And so when someone calls me out on doing or saying something racist or doing something that perpetuates or upholds like racist systems, that doesn't feel good for me. That's not a feeling that I enjoy. And my gut reaction is to like when somebody calls me out on that is to want to be like, oh no, 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 I didn't mean it that way. Or no, like you're misunderstanding, or you know, this isn't, I want to like push it away, right? Because again, it's not a fun feeling for me because it's something that I care so deeply about. But the problem with that is that you can't change what you don't acknowledge. Um, and so I kept seeing this same pattern. John said happens to the best of us. It 100%, John. I think that there's a lot of, especially in, I think that there is a widespread issue in spaces that pride themselves on being inclusive, especially as those spaces move more and more online, in looking to find fault with people and the idea that everybody should come pre-educated and 100% educated. And it's not realistic for a variety of things that we'll talk about. But I'm fortunate to have access to the communities that I do, to have access to the education that I do through my lived experience. And that's a privilege that not everybody has. So something I have said before, yelled before, is you did not fall out of your mama's womb. No one would have preferred gender pronoun is, right? It's not a moral failing to not know these things. Like especially like if it's our lived experience, it's something that we have to think about all the time. Like in and of itself is a privilege to have access to that. So I'm circling back around, circling. But thank you. Yes. John, thank you for that, saying that happens to the best of us, because I agree. Coming back. So when I was in college, I kept noticing this was a problem I was noticing in a recurring way, right? That these spaces were really inaccessible. And so I started doing a workshop that I called GaySL, a crash course in LGBTQ sign language, as a way to trick hearing people into learning a little bit about deaf culture and ASL, and then no longer giving them an excuse to not provide interpreters. So I started doing these workshops where I would teach signs for LGBTQ related sign language that I actually had the opportunity to do at CU Boulder last year, 2 years ago, I believe. But that was my plan. And I would talk about intersectional accessibility, kind of as how we've outlined it, right? So talking about intersectionality as the intersection of one or more or of two or more marginalized identities, and talking about accessibility as even from the social model, but breaking down those barriers for when it comes to accessibility for physical disability, right? Because I think most of the time when we talk about accessibility, that's kind of the focus. When I say accessibility, I think most people tend to think things like sign language interpreters, wheelchair ramps, parking, things like that. So, and that's when I went into this teaching these workshops, that's what I was doing, and that's what I was talking about. Because as we talked about in that example a little bit, I think there's a unique vulnerability that comes up at the intersection of disabled identities and any other marginalized identities, because the way we navigate around disability, most accessibility in the Western world in particular, tends to come from relying on people. So for example, like relying on sign language interpreters. And more, it's like become tech. So things like captioning or whatever, but there's a lot of relying on people. So things like a personal care attendant, things like a driver for blind and visually impaired people. There's a lot of relying on those people who are vulnerable to their own lived experiences, who are vulnerable to their own bias and their own lack of experience of education. So I feel like there's a unique vulnerability there, which is why I started talking about intersectional accessibility from that perspective, that two or more marginalized identities and how they come together, and the special occurrences that happen at that intersection, and accessibility as it pertains to physical disability. But so I started doing those, I think, my junior or senior year of college, and I did my degree at the University of Missouri. I did a bachelor's degree of fisheries and wildlife, it's just a bachelor's degree of redneck science is all it is. Do they offer that at CU Boulder?
Not to my knowledge.
Do they, Sonja? I saw Sonja nod.
Kind of. We have classes on it, and I think there's a minor. Yeah, and we have e-bio, so environmental biology, ecology, and evolutionary
environmental
biology.
science.
Yeah.
Environmental science and is the much classier. That's for people who can use indoor plumbing regularly. Fisheries and wildlife is a diversion program for people who would otherwise be feral in the woods. It's very fun. I like it a lot. I had I had more than one professor who wore overalls and no shirts. Celine, it was amazing, but it's a very different culture than I think most people are exposed to. Certainly, I grew up in the Metro Detroit area, so a more urban environment, and I went to a school for if you've seen the show Arrested Development, they talk about they send one of the characters to what they call a new age feel-goodery. I grew up going to a new age feel-goodery. And so this transition into this rural environment, this very Fish and Wildlife was a much different experience. And there were not, I don't know if you guys are going to believe this, there were not a ton of out LGBTQ people in the Fish and Wildlife department at the University of Missouri. There were really like 3 of us in my year, and the 3 of us were buds, and we hung out together and we went and did all sorts of fun things together. And we were in our senior year. So after I had already started doing these workshops on the side, we were in our senior year in the library, and one of our mutual friends, who was not a part of the 3 of us, a separate person, she said something very casually about her girlfriend. And the 3 of us were like, her girlfriend? What? Her girl? We were like meerkats. We were like, what? Your girlfriend? And our friend goes, yeah, my girlfriend. And we were like, well, dude, like, welcome to the party. Like, what's up, right? Like, why haven't we seen you? Like, we go, because we went to all sorts of events together. We went to like all sorts of like, we went to Pride, and we went to like events at the Queer Center, and we went to like all this stuff. And, we hung out, we did things together. And we were like, well, why haven't you seen us there? Like, come and join us. And my friend said, and I'll never forget this, because she goes, I don't do that stuff because I'm not going to go any place where they're going to call me a fucking queer. So the 3 of us who felt comfortable being out in the program, we all came from more urban environments. We came from bigger cities where, the being queer was not as big a deal. And even the label itself, calling things queer, we knew it used to be a slur, but it had since been reclaimed, and it was used more as kind of an umbrella term for anybody who's wasn't cisgender or straight. And so we went to like queer events at the Queer Center and did all this queer stuff. And for my friend, that was not the case. So my friend grew up in a very isolated part of rural southern Missouri. Her family lived in what used to be like were now abandoned army barracks and like subsistence hunted meat to get them through the winter. And for her, the word queer was very much not reclaimed. It was very much actively still a slur, and it's a word that had been used as a weapon against her for her entire adolescence. And so she wasn't, as an adult with the ability to, make choices, she wasn't going to go someplace where she was going to have that word applied to her, regardless of how it was being used. That word held so much pain and so much trauma for her that she was not going to go to these events, to these community spaces, where that word was going to be applied to her non-consensually. And these events and these spaces that she was missing out on, like I told you, the 3 of us were lucky to have grown up in a space where we had access to those kind of resources, and our friend didn't. She probably would have benefited from the resources that she could have found at the LGBTQ Center, at Pride, in all of these educational events, much more than the 3 of us did, right? And because of her experiences, because of her identities, she wasn't able to access them in the same way that I am not able to access that information when it's not captioned or interpreted, in the same way my friend wasn't able to access that panel when the room wasn't wheelchair accessible, right? And so when we talk about intersectionality, I had this kind of light bulb moment, because when we talk about intersectionality, we almost exclusively, even to this day, we almost exclusively talk about it in the terms of marginalized identity A meets marginalized identity B, which is very valid because that's what it was coined to talk about, right? But the problem with that is that we are not just identity A plus identity B, and that's the end of it, right? Like, I am, when we do that bio up at the top, it says that I am deaf or hard of hearing and queer, and that's true, but I'm also white, which is a huge part of my identity. I live in a rural area. I'm a comedian. That would be, I was just talking to somebody about how that has kind of, that's a huge part of my identity in the way that I identify. And again, not something that gets brought up on a checklist. And for my friend, she identified very strongly as a Southern conservative lesbian woman. And again, when we talk about the marginalization, like when we talk about these marginalized identities and we talk about intersectionality from that framework, we don't talk about, you know, rural as an identity. We don't talk about political affiliation or being raised in those political affiliations as part of that identity. I had the opportunity to do this workshop at a Catholic college in New York. And it was my first time ever being mandatory. And for like I did it for freshman orientation weekend for this Catholic college in New York. And for like leading up to it, I was like on such a power trip because I was like, I'm mandatory. Like they have to be here, right? It felt amazing up until I was on stage and I realized that they had to be there, that they had, they didn't want to be. And you know how like they'll play loud bad music to get people to like leave the house in a hostage situation? Like that was like I was the loud bad music that was being played at this several hundred Catholic college students. And so it was not an environment that had a lot of buy-in already to the value of social justice, to the ideas of intersectionality, and the idea that intersectionality or accessibility would apply to them. So I said, okay, you guys have to be here. You're all freshmen, right? So does anybody here have an identity that intersects with that identity as freshmen that they think might change the way they experience this year, that might create a barrier into being able to fully participate, to having that full accessibility to all of everything of what it means to be a freshman here, that maybe the person sitting next to you isn't going to experience? And one girl immediately raised her hand and she said, yes, I'm an identical twin. And this weekend is my first weekend ever being away from my identical twin sister because she's going to a different college. And I'm really struggling to figure out how I navigate this huge change, leaving my house for the first time as an 18-year-old, starting college, starting my independent life without my literal number one support system from before I was born who shares my face. And I said, oh my God, yeah, 100%, right? 100%. That's a huge part of her identity and also something that's going to definitely impact the way she navigates her experience as a freshman. But again, when we talk about intersectional accessibility in a mainstream way, we don't talk about like twin identity, right? We don't talk about twin as being a disabling thing, right? We don't talk about twin as being a marginalized identity, but 100% that is going to impact the resources that she needs to thrive and the way she navigates that space. Another boy then raised his hand and he said, I am the first foster kid in my county to graduate high school and go to college. And this is being paid for by a combination of the state and my foster parents. And I'm really nervous because I feel like my success or failure here is going to dictate the success or failure of the students who come after me, the foster kids that come after me. 100%. 100%, that's going to change the resources he needs. It's going to impact the barriers that he experiences in his education. And it's a huge part of his identity, literally down to the name that he used to register for school. And when we talk about intersectionality and we talk about disability in these mainstream ways, intersectionality is marginalized identity A plus B, and disability as what part of our physical body isn't adding up to the norm. We lose all of these other these other intersections that make up who we are, right? We lose sight of all these other barriers because we're not identity A plus B, right? We're not only disabled or able based on our physical body, right? Like we are multidimensional, complex people who are made up of all of our lived experiences and the way we navigate the world. And you know, it's dependent on so many different things. And so that led me to what I call my theory of intersectional accessibility, which says very briefly, how do we make our resources, how do we make our spaces, how do we make our communities the most accessible to the widest range of whole, complex, multifaceted people? And that's where things start. It's a lot to put on someone to do that whole to throw that whole thing, because then it changes things. We're no longer looking at the intersection of identity A and identity B. We're looking at every possible intersection of every possible identity ever. And we're not just looking at physical disability. We're looking at anything that could possibly cause a barrier to full and complete access for anyone based on any of those identities ever. And it becomes a lot more complicated, because I think that there's a tendency to think of accessibility, when we think about it in this mainstream way of addressing physical disability, we tend to think about it as having to be like, what do we do before the event? How do we know? Like, everything needs to be perfect. And then, we have accessibility. Like, accessibility is treated like a checklist, like it's something that's done or not done, and you either provide the thing or you don't. And when you talk about how can you possibly preempt every possible combination of everything ever and make sure that there's no barrier, it's just not possible. So thank you guys for coming. No, I'm kidding. There's more, right? But I'm kind of not kidding, because it isn't possible. It's just not realistic or feasible to expect that going into a space you could preempt and tear down every possible barrier ever. But luckily for us, intersectional accessibility is not about knowing and doing all of those things before they're brought to your attention, right? It's not about preempting everything. It's about making your spaces the most accessible and working with your community to tear down those barriers on an ongoing basis. And when you think about it as like that partnership and collaboration, like that attitude is what intersectional accessibility is about. It becomes a lot more accessible. So there are some bigger strategies. No, I'm not going to talk about that yet. I want to talk about why intersectional accessibility is important. And we talked a little bit about, like, you want people to be fully included, but when you broaden these things up, right? Part of what's, no, I lied. We're going back. I'm circling around. I jumped ahead. It's been a minute since I've done this workshop, which clearly I'm passionate about. So it's very easy to send me off on a tangent. So when you are creating intersectionally accessible spaces, right, there's steps that you can take to make that easier, to make that a more attainable thing. Because again, it is a big, broad umbrella, right? So the number one thing that you can do is make it known that you want to make your spaces more intersectionally accessible. So we are, like we talked about earlier, right? Like, we are limited by our own perspectives, right? Like, this is the only lived experience that I have. It's my only reference point. So like, when that woman brought up, I'm an identical twin, that's not something that I would have had the privilege of having foresight into, right? So when you put it out there that you want to make your spaces more intersectionally accessible, that you're interested in knowing what barriers people are experiencing so that you can work on them as a community, I promise you that people will bring that information to you. I promise you. So something that I've been seeing lately that I really love is, I used to see a lot of, like on event posters, I would see the interpreting thingy. If you've ever seen like that label like this, it means like interpreting is available or can be made available. But I've been seeing a shift to like, please contact whoever for your accessibility needs and concerns. And I love that, because it's a little bit more open-ended, right? So instead of saying just, we do offer interpreting or we don't, what are your access needs, right? Please tell us, and we'll do the best that we can. The place that I think the most people get stuck in social justice spaces and otherwise in all spaces is that when people bring you that information, you then have to do something with that information. That, I feel like, it seems really obvious, but that's where I see the most individuals, organizations, that's where people get stuck the most. Because again, like we talked about, right? It is, when people bring you that information, it can feel like a failure. Especially when people deliver it in a way that's maybe tinged with frustration of things being inaccessible, tinged with hurt. When people can deliver that information in a way that doesn't always feel gracious. But like, you can't change what you don't acknowledge, right? And so when we shut things down with like, well, it just wasn't possible, we just didn't have the time, we didn't have the money, or we don't know how to do that, or whatever it is, you're shutting down all of those, like it feels better in the moment, and you're shutting down any possibility of making your spaces more intersectionally accessible. And like we talked about too, though, we recognize that there are real world limitations. Like I fully recognize that it would be great for me to just say like, everybody provide interpreter and but it's not a reality a lot of times, particularly in spaces that are geared around supporting people with marginalized identities, places that provide access, like offices of accessibility, LGBTQ centers, and like any sort of space or organization serving marginalized communities would like it's not a limitless resource party. The problem is, or not the problem, but when we look at accessibility as a matter of can or can't, we're shutting a conversation down. So to me, intersectional accessibility never says we can do this or we can't do this. We say, how are we going to do this? How are we going to use the resources that we have to tear down the barrier to the best of our ability? When you miss so many things when you start that self-limiting framework of this is the solution, and we can't do that, right? We don't have the funding. I'm really big on value exchange. I work in the arts. I am a big supporter of people need to be paid for their labor. People's emotional labor has value, people's physical labor has value, and people need to be compensated for that. Interpreters do not work for free, right? But sometimes there are value exchanges that aren't direct one-to-one cash exchanges. So I started doing shows with Looney's Comedy Club, which is in Colorado Springs. And the first show that I did there, I was talking to the booker there, whose name is Tracy Kellett, and she's exceptional. And Tracy said, well, like, you're gonna have to walk me through getting an interpreter because I don't know how to do this. And I said, Tracy, I'm not like, you don't have to. I know what I'm saying, right? Like, you don't have to. That's a space where I, as a comedian, tend not to request interpreters for the shows that I'm on because it makes me a more expensive comic to hire than somebody else. And especially something where it's not like an outright meritocracy. It makes me harder to book. And so I said, Tracy, don't worry about it. And she was like, that's great. She was like, it's embarrassing for me if I have a deaf comedian and the show isn't accessible. And she's like, so I'm going to do this. And so she went and she got some quotes from interpreting agencies, and the margins that comedy clubs run on are razor thin. And it wasn't a matter of whether she wanted to or she didn't want to. She didn't have the money to be able to pay the interpreter. And she said, well, shoot. But then she said, well, what if instead of paying you, what if instead you get 2 tickets to whatever show you want to go to for the rest of the year? Like, if you come and interpret this for us, we'll give you 2 tickets to whatever show you want to see for the rest of the year, and you and whoever you bring will drink for free at Looney's. And about a bazillion interpreters said, I will do it. That there's value in that for me. I'm willing to do that. And so they started having interpreters coming out. Because there was more than one set of interpreter that wanted to do that, wanted to take that deal, right? There was value in that. And so they said, okay, well, then we'll have interpreters at the next show, and then the next show, and then the next show. And because they had interpreters at every show, the deaf community started coming out, and there were more and more deaf people because they didn't have to request an interpreter. They knew that there was going to be one already at the show. And then we had more and more deaf people coming out. So these shows got bigger and more people started finding out about it. And then because there were more deaf people there, it actually became a really good interpreting experience. And so the interpreters started saying, well, do you mind if we start bringing students? Can we use this, like interpreting students? Can we use this as a training opportunity? And the community and the club said, absolutely. And it's grown into this big, beautiful thing that started because instead of saying, we can't afford it, oh well, which is, by the way, what I had said, my friend Tracy said, no, we're going to figure out how to do this. And it's just become this incredible thing. And there's something called universal design. So it's the idea that when you design for things to make things accessible, that you end up benefiting a much broader range of people that you would have even imagined. So for example, it's something called the curb cut effect. So you guys know curb cuts, the little down in the sidewalk for you to bring, at the corners and stuff, you go, okay. So curb cuts were originally wheeled out in, or rolled out in Kalamazoo, Michigan after World War I believe, and they were a city initiative as a way to honor and thank returning veterans who are now wheelchair users, returning World War I veterans who are now wheelchair users. To make it easier for them to get around town. It was a way for them to show that they were respecting and honoring these sacrifices that these people had made. And so they rolled these out, and immediately the city was flooded with positive feedback from mail carriers and new moms who loved how easy these curb cuts made it to bring strollers around town and to wheel like packages and stuff through town. So it's the idea that if you start designing with groups in mind, that you never know who you're going to benefit. Do you guys like texting? Any texters in the house? You're welcome. Texting was born out of the deaf text relay system. Internet, even the first prototypical internet was the result of a deaf staff member who like needed a way to be able to like communicate and send things without having to like print it off and talk in the phone. All of these other things, there's like so many things that are born out of these, the accommodations that we make for one small group and go on to have limitless benefit. And I'm somebody who believes when we talk about the importance of intersectional accessibility, like I think that obviously there's value in being able to for these physical accessibility things that end up making life easier for everybody. But I think even if you make that, you make an accommodation and the literal only person it helps is the one person that you made it for. That's the only person who it has any noticeable impact on. I think that there's benefit in having that person be a part of your community. Because I think that there tends to be this framing of accessibility and accommodations as something that is bestowed upon the disabled receiver. That the accommodation is a gift that's given from the person without a disability to the person that has one. There's a lot of like morality that goes with it. And I see that most often when I talk about my dogs. I love deaf dogs. 3 of my 4 dogs are deaf. I have a brand to maintain. One of them is totally deaf and blind. If you guys want to see her, I can go get her. Bird, come on. So let's see. She'll pop up here. Come here, bird. Yep, you're gonna snort. Yeah. Oh, if she'll show up on camera, but this is the little snorts and grunts that you're hearing who just knocked my computer over. That's Bitsy. Bitsy is totally deaf and blind, and she's the coolest dog ever. She's the easiest dog I've ever had. And when I got her, nobody thought that she was going to be like, everybody thinks that her life is going to be like sad and difficult, and that like I'm a super nice person for taking her on, for doing the things that I do for her. Even my dad, who again has a disabled kid, when I had Bitsy and we were talking about how amazing she is, because she does, there she is in the background. She does like adaptive agility. She does all sorts of cool stuff, right? She's lived with me in New York City. She canoes, she kayaks. And my dad was saying how we were talking about how awesome she is. And my dad goes, yeah, he's like, but you do a lot of extra stuff for her. You do a lot of work for her. And it was so funny because I think of Bitsy as being the lowest effort dog that I have. I had a pit bull who just passed away who was reactive towards everything. He was my only sighted and hearing dog, and he was so much more work than any of the deaf blind dogs. But people don't think about the accommodations that I made for him as being, there was none of that moralizing, right? Because it wasn't an outright disability. And so I told my dad, I was like, it's not more work, it's just different work. And I don't think of what I do for Bitsy as work, because that's like, it's just what you do when someone's a part of your space, right? So like I have a little sister who's a vegetarian, and when we go out to dinner together, I don't pick out Back Steakhouse, right? And it's not, people don't think of that as me, like nobody goes, oh my God, like you're such a good sibling, because I'm not, right? It's the things that you do when someone's a part of your community. Like now I got bit by, this is a whole other thing, but I got bit by that bug that makes you allergic to red meat. And so like my girlfriend who loves steak, she doesn't eat it when I'm around because it's a bummer for me, right? And nobody goes, oh my God, like what a sacrifice It's what you do when somebody is a part of your community. And for some reason, when these these are all accommodations, right? They're all things that you do for someone just because they're an equal part of your community. It's what you do to make them feel included. And we don't put the same moralization on it as we do when it's a disability accommodation. Like, an example that I love is like, I'm more comfortable not wearing pants. I don't think pants are comfortable, and yet I'm wearing them right now as an accommodation that I'm making for you all. And nobody says I'm like such a brave, loving warrior for doing that, right? Accommodations aren't a gift. They're the things that you do for people in your community. And I think that even if they end up benefiting that one person, we're a better community when we have that person in it, when we use our resources to make our spaces the most accessible for everybody, because I think it's a responsibility that we have to each other. But even when it is just like that one person, I also like selfishly, there's a benefit in having that diversity of perspectives. I spoke at NASA last year, like literal for real NASA in Florida. And I asked why, why would you they had a whole disability week initiative that they no longer have. But I said, this is crazy. I was not what I was expecting from NASA. And they told me very succinctly, but very firmly that you don't put a man on the moon by doing things and looking at things the way they've always been looked at. Like that there's value in having that diversity of perspectives. I literally yesterday, I read an article about the collaboration that's been happening between neonatal intensive care units and F1 racing. Because Sonja, I see you nodding. If you saw that, it's incredible is that that there was in the handoff between like a baby being born and going to the NICU, they were losing a lot of infants. And these two doctors happened to go to an F1 race and saw how efficiently the Ferrari team was able to communicate, and how they were able to communicate to make sure and fix this car and in a way that it didn't explode in 6 seconds. And they said, boy, we could be doing that. And so they wrote and changed protocol based on with Ferrari and McLaren's input on how do you communicate effectively, quickly in this high stress environment. And their infant mortality rates plummeted. There's such value in having that diversity of perspectives. And even if it's just that one person, it's the responsibility we have to each other. The final step, or the final best takeaway I can give you in making your spaces more intersectionally accessible is doing stuff like this is great. Reaching out to people, bringing people into your community who have a different perspective. Thank you so much for having me here. It's amazing to be here, and it's such a privilege to be able to share my perspective with you. And also, I have a limited perspective. My perspective is informed by the privileges that allow me to be the one here. My parents were both medical doctors who were able to afford a ton of speech therapy for me and resources that have given me the ability to communicate a deaf and hard of hearing perspective in a way that's palatable to the mainstream. I was able to take a financial risk and start speaking as a career because I knew that if it crashed and burned, that I would be okay financially, right? There's all these other intersecting identities that led me to be the one that you see. So recognizing that you're getting that outside feedback, you're implementing it, but the people who are able to give you that feedback are the people who are able to access you to give it to you in the first place. Particularly we're in a higher ed space, right? There are so many barriers to access, and to being able to come to a symposium like this, that's incredible. I looked through your the information that Marysia shared with me. This is amazing. And the people who are able to come here and the perspectives that you're seeing are the people who are able to get here in the first place. So something I think that for all of its ills and all of the havoc that it's wrought upon society, for me, social media is a spectacular way to be exposed to thousands of perspectives I would never have access to otherwise. On TikTok, I follow this Maori man in New Zealand who talks about Indigenous culture and language and shares his perspective. That's somebody I would never get to meet otherwise. I follow a lady who lives on a tiny island near the North Pole and talks about day-to-day life there. It's a perspective I would never, ever have access to. I follow this West African fashion designer who lives in a rural village and creates these cool, goes to New York and Paris Fashion Week, but with designs that are influenced by living in this rural village and created out of local cloth. It's amazing. And these are all these perspectives that I wouldn't have even known I was missing if I hadn't had access to them at my fingertips. So we are at 2:00. Again, I cannot thank you guys enough for having me here. If you have any follow-up questions, if there's anything that I can do or say to be helpful, I'm happy. I don't know, Sonja and Marysia, if you guys need to leave, if we need to end it right now, that's fine, but I'm also here to answer questions if